He fixed her broken blade, unaware she was the ruthless ruler of a galaxy. The wastelands of Oros 9 were a graveyard of forgotten wars. Rusting wrecks buried in dune-choked silence, broken drones like vultures caught mid-scream, and ash drifting in the wind like dead prayers. It was not a place where heroes walked or empires lingered. It was where history went to decay, where mercenaries came to vanish, and where human scavenger warriors like Ryland Vance tried to stretch one more day of life out of salvaged metal and scraped protein packs. His workshop was a repurposed cargo hold built into the cliffside, more coffin than home, but it held his tools, his solitude, and his rules. Don't ask questions, don't make attachments, and never fix what bleeds. The storm had just passed when he saw the streak of fire tear through the sky. It was no meteor. The angle was wrong, the descent to controlled, the flare of deceleration to precise. Ryland watched it tumble behind the ridge, heard the distant rumble of impact, and against every instinct he'd sharpened over years of surviving nothing but other people's mistakes, he strapped on his oxygen rig and went to look. He found the wreck at dusk, half-buried hull, scorched, one wing sheared clean off. The ship looked like a bird that had flown too close to the sun, and then he saw her. She was crawling from the cockpit, barely conscious, her body bruised and covered in blood-smeared dirt. Her armor was half-melted, elegant in a way Ryland had never seen before, like it had been forged, not just for war, but for something ceremonial, something ancient. One of her arms dangled uselessly. The other clenched a sword so fractured it looked like it had wept when it shattered. She collapsed in front of him without a word, clutching that blade like it was the last part of her soul she could hold together. Ryland could have left. He should have. There was no telling what kind of mess she brought with her, and he wasn't in the business of dragging ghosts back to life. But he looked down at the sword. Not military issue, not mass-produced, but something handcrafted, layered with alloy. Markings older than any language in his database, something sacred. He gently lifted it from her grip, surprised by its weight. The moment his fingers closed around it, he felt warmth. Not heat, not energy, but presence. Like the sword, recognized the touch. He turned it slowly in the fading light, noting the fracture lines, the dislodged core, the missing spine crystal. She stirred then, eyes fluttering open. Not human, not even close. Her pupils were elongated and silver-flecked, her face marked by a single vertical stripe of crimson from brow to chin, a sigil he didn't recognize. Don't touch it, she rasped. You'll be marked. Ryland didn't let go. Too late, he said. Then he did what he hadn't done in years. He carried her back to his shop. The restoration days that followed were slow, measured in the rhythm of hammers, welders, and the hum of ancient tech. The woman didn't wake much. When she did, she said little. But Ryland didn't need her words to know the truth. She wasn't just a crash survivor. She was someone important, maybe dangerous, and definitely not from any system he recognized. The sword lay on his workbench like a wound that needed tending. And Ryland, despite every warning sign, found himself obsessed with fixing it. He stripped the hilt first, revealing a core matrix built on crystalline resonance unlike anything he'd worked with. Not Terran, not Alari, something older, something forbidden, maybe even extinct. The moment he aligned the fracture lines and restabilized the conduit pulse, the sword emitted a low, mournful tone, like it was remembering what it once was. She watched from the cot, saying nothing. Her gaze burned through him, but he didn't stop. He calibrated the flux ratio, rebuilt the fractured spine, and reforged the edges with microplasma precision. It wasn't just repair, it was restoration, like healing an ancient scar left open for too long. On the fourth day, she spoke without looking at him. You have no idea what you're fixing. Story of my life, Ryland replied, eyes still on his work. I could have killed you in your sleep. You still might. She turned her head then, fully facing him. You don't ask who I am. Why? Because whatever you were, it doesn't matter here. Just rust and rock and tools. She was silent for a long time. Then, almost reluctantly, she said, I was born in the Crimson Palace on Trin XV. My name is Sailor Vex, and I ruled over 12 systems, feared for 1,000 years. Ryland's hands froze over the blade. He looked up, his brow furrowed not with fear, but disbelief. You're that Solarian? He asked. The Ghost Queen, the one who burned the Imperial Reach to ash. Her eyes narrowed. I didn't burn it. I watched it rot. I just helped it fall. He nodded slowly. Still, hell of a resume. Solarian leaned back, her lips curling into something unreadable. And you? Who are you, Tehran? Ryland wiped grease from his fingers. Nobody, just a man who fixes things. She stared at him for a long time. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Then you are more dangerous than I ever was, outside." A dust storm began to rise, and in the fading light of his workshop, the sword began to glow again, whole, gleaming, and reborn like its queen. The weight of the pasthy sword stood propped upright on Ryland's workbench, its reconstructed edges gleaming faintly beneath a haze of flickering plasma lights. Sailor had not touched it since he finished the repair, not because she feared it, but because something deep in her bones told her it no longer belonged to war. Not in the same way. She watched Ryland the way you might watch an old flame in a dream, unsure if it was real, terrified it might be. He meanwhile spoke little of her past. Not because he didn't believe it, there was too much weight in her gaze, too much command in her posture, but because he knew better than to treat queens like relics. He kept fixing things. Fuel pumps, data relays, a broken music drone she hadn't heard in centuries. One evening, she asked him to come outside. The moons of Oros 9 had risen in fractured halves, reflecting their light against the sand-blasted cliffs like ancient silver blades. They sat in silence for a long time on the ridge overlooking the wreck of her ship, which he'd begun repurposing for spare parts. "I thought I'd die in that crash," she said at last. Her voice no longer clipped and regal, but distant, like it was speaking to herself across time. It would have been fitting a queen lost in exile, buried in silence. He didn't respond. Not right away. He'd seen that look before. On veterans too tired to speak, on children who'd lived through too much war too young. "You survived," he said. "That means something. To you," she replied. "To the galaxy. It means an old terror still breathes." Ryland leaned back on his elbows. "You could lie low, build something new. No crown, no armies." She turned her face toward him. "Why are you helping me?" He glanced at her, eyes sharp. "Because no one ever helped me, and I know what it means when someone should have." That silenced her more than any threat ever had. She didn't sleep that night. She stood by the sword for hours, staring at it. Then she turned away and began to disassemble what remained of her Imperial Comms relay, stripping it bare, smashing its signal booster with her bare hands until sparks bled into the night air. By morning, only static remained. Static and silence, and for the first time, she didn't feel the urge to command anyone. The return of old loyalty came 2 weeks later, not with trumpets or banners, but in ships that swallowed clouds and left orbits scorched. The scales of Carrick, remnants of a fallen galactic regime Sailor once ruled with fire and justice, twisted into obedience, had finally traced her signal. Ryland spotted the patrol cruiser long before it landed. His instincts screamed at him to run, to hide her again. But she stood calmly beside the fence line, arms crossed, her cloak fluttering. In the wind, 3 figures emerged from the ship. They wore old crimson armor, the kind etched with the eye of dominion her crest. Their leader approached, helmet tucked under one arm, his face scarred with memory. "High Sovereign," he said, kneeling, "we found you. The galaxy still needs your iron." Her jaw clenched. "You found a woman with a garden and dust in her lungs. That is all I am now." He raised his gaze. "You raised stars to obey. You scorched traitors into legends. We don't need your mercy. We need your sword." Ryland stepped forward. "She's not that person anymore." The soldiers turned toward him like he was a bug underfoot. But before they could speak, she stepped between them. "This man reforged what I had forgotten," she said. "He didn't kneel. He didn't demand. He gave me back choice." The leader's hand went to his sidearm. "Then he has stolen your strength." In a breath, her fingers closed around the hilt of her sword, not raised in fury, but held at her side, calm as the void. "You misunderstand," she said. "He gave me something no soldier ever could. Peace." The soldiers froze. A quiet tension filled the air, old loyalties twisting in the heat. "You can kneel again," she said coldly, "or you can burn." There was a moment, one heartbeat, when Ryland thought they might fire. But then the leader slowly dropped to one knee, his armor creaking beneath his shame. "We didn't follow you to be free," he said. "We followed because we were lost." She stepped past him without another word, walking straight into the open cargo bay of their ship. But instead of boarding, she turned and pointed her sword toward the heavens. "Fly," she ordered. "Scatter to the edge of stars. Forget me. or remember me as I am now. That is your freedom." The soldiers hesitated. Then, one by one, they reboarded. When the ship vanished, the sky was quiet again. Sailor dropped her sword into the sand and didn't pick it up. Rilin came to her side. "So what now?" She didn't look at him. "Now I decide who I want to be, not what they made me." And he didn't reply. He simply stood beside her in the heat and said nothing. The way all warriors do when silence is the only thing worth offering. The Gardendi warship was gone. The message had been sent. Yet even in silence, Sailor knew the stars were not done with her. The galaxy had been built on her name, painted in her wrath, shaped by her shadow. And shadows did not vanish just because one walked into the sun. But there was something different now, something she hadn't known. She craved the weightlessness of days unmeasured by conquest. Rilin never asked her for more than her presence. Not loyalty, not stories, just help around the scrap lot and the small garden he had tried and failed to grow for years. His vegetables wilted, his soil was to dry, his patience thin when it came to things that didn't spark or roar, but she had once seeded entire planets with engineered ecosystems. She had made dying moons bloom, if only so her armies could eat. So one morning, without speaking, she found his old tools, cleared the rows, and began again. The first time he saw her kneeling in the dirt, her hands buried up to the wrist, Rilin stopped mid-step. She looked over her shoulder, her brow furrowed beneath the streak of war paint still faint on her skin. He didn't say a word, just watched. "I need ammonium extract," she said. "You don't have any." He blinked slowly. "That's because I'm not a planetary bioengineer." She tossed a seed pot at his chest. "Then be useful and get me some silicate mulch." Over the next 3 weeks, the patch of failed farmland transformed into something wild and alien and oddly beautiful. Some of the sprouts glowed faintly under moonlight. Some whispered when the wind blew through their leaves. One tried to bite Rilin's boot. Sailor only smiled and named it Rogan. She slept less and less in the bunk. She spent most nights outside, speaking softly to the dirt, to the wind, to something deeper that hummed beneath the surface of Oros 9. It wasn't ruling. It wasn't killing. It wasn't fleeing. It was healing. One night, while she was adjusting a photosynthetic array over a bed of luminous beans, Rilin brought her a mug of something steaming and bitter. "I thought queens had people for this," he said. She took the mug. "They do." He leaned on the fence beside her. "And yet here you are." "I was never meant to stay on thrones," she said. "Only pass through them." "I think I always knew." He studied her face, the line of her jaw, the cracks in her armor she no longer bothered to repair. "You could have ruled forever," he murmured. "I did," she answered. "And it cost me more than eternity was worth." She looked at him then, really looked. And for a moment, the firelight of old wars danced in her eyes. But it wasn't fury. It was reflection. A queen who no longer needed to be obeyed, only understood. And Rilin, for once, didn't look away. The crownless Lijanthi came without warning, without honor, without sound. The sky did not shimmer. The soil did not tremble. But Rilin felt it first, the way a man feels the air shift before a storm. The way predators announce themselves not with noise, but with the sudden vanishing of everything else. It wasn't the scales of Carrick. It wasn't even anyone Solarian had ruled. This was something older, something darker, something that had waited. He heard the crackle of distortion, the quiet hum of shields activating in the upper stratosphere. And by the time he reached the ridge overlooking the old crash site, they were already descending. 6 ships, sleek, silent, black as collapsed gravity. Sailor stood beside him in seconds, her face unreadable. She wasn't surprised. They followed. "The relays echo," she whispered. "Even broken, those signals never truly die." "Who are they?" Rilin asked. "The Crownless Legion," she said, voice tight. "They are what came before the empires. They feed on the corpses of kingdoms. They've waited centuries for my heart to stop beating." He looked at her, jaw tense, and now she turned toward him. "Now, they've come to rip it out while I sleep." Her sword was still in the sand. She walked to it slowly, knelt, and lifted it with both hands. It glowed like a wound healed too quickly. "I buried this life," she said, "and I dug it back up," Rilin added. She looked at him. "Then let's make that mistake beautiful." They didn't wait for the Legion to land. They ran toward the heat of descent, toward the battle neither of them wanted but both were ready for. He moved with the fluid economy of a man who'd fought for breath and bone, not banners. She moved like a comet learning restraint, every step, measured, every breath a choice. The first shock wave hit the canyon's edge, blowing their cover apart. Ryland dove behind a rusted shuttle husk, pulling her with him. Energy beams sizzled overhead, melting rock like wax. They were outgunned, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, but not outwilled. Sailorin leapt into the open with a scream that tore open the sky, her blade arcing in a perfect line that severed gravity around it. The first two legionaries dissolved before they could register her shape. The third fell to Ryland's bullet, timed perfectly between her swings. They moved like they'd fought together for decades. They hadn't, but something older than time bound them now. The air sang with fury, and somewhere, in the thick of smoke and scorched metal, Ryland found himself smiling. "You're enjoying this?" Sailor growled as she drove a blade through another soldier. "I've been bored since I met you," he shouted back. The final dropship exploded in a bloom of red light, and silence fell again. Not peace, just the aftermath. She staggered, blood paining her mouth. He caught her before she fell. "This isn't over," she gasped. He nodded. "Then neither are we." He didn't carry her back this time. They walked, broken and breathing, into the rising wind of dawn. Hand in hand, queen and fixer, past and future crashing in their wake. The awakening Ryland awoke to the sound of roots cracking stone. The garden had changed overnight. Where once delicate alien vines crept softly along the soil, now thick glowing. Stalks pierced through the ground like spears of living crystal, pulsing with light. Flowers bloomed that smelled like memory, sweet and strange, and the leaves whispered in a language he didn't understand but recognized all the same. Something had awakened. Solarian was already in the garden, barefoot, eyes closed, hands outstretched. The earth rippled beneath her, not shaking, listening. Ryland watched from the edge of the yard, unsure whether to speak. She looked older somehow, not in age, but in gravity, as if the weight of what she'd once been was returning to rest upon her shoulders. Or maybe she was rising to meet it. When she opened her eyes, they burned not with rage, not with pain, but with decision. "They're not done," she said softly. "The Legion was only the first. The moment I drew breath again, the old powers stirred. Every crown I cast down, every tyrant I deposed. Their descendants are clawing their way out of the void." He stepped forward slowly. "Then we fight again." "No," she whispered. "This time we warned them." Later that day, they activated the long-range transmitter she'd once destroyed. It was patched together from scrap and dreams, held in place by Ryland's stubborn engineering and Sailorin's precise recalibration. When the signal launched, it pulsed like a heartbeat across the stars. One simple message, encrypted in a dead language. "I am no longer yours to fear. But if you come, you will leave broken." Ryland leaned on the rail beside her. "You sure they'll listen?" She turned to him, expression unreadable. "I'm sure they'll hear." The pilgrimage ships began to move. Not just warships, not just scavengers or opportunist refugees, rebels, old loyalists who still bore the mark of the Crimson Throne, children who had been told stories of a queen who scorched injustice and vanished into legend. They came not with fire, but with questions, and in the quiet between arrivals, Sailor taught Ryland how to plant the old seeds not of war, but of renewal. They built a second greenhouse together. He insisted on Terran tomatoes. She insisted on Zevian starroot. They both gave in, grumbling but smiling. Then, at sunset, the ground shook again. This time it wasn't from her plants. It was from the descent of the Dominion's Rift. The ancient tribunal ship hadn't been seen in over 400 years. It landed with the subtlety of a god exhaling. 3 figures exited, cloaked in obsidian and silence, their faces hidden by masks of law. They did not speak. They radiated authority. Sailor stood before them, unarmed, unafraid. "I will not bow," she said. They answered in unison. "We have not come for you to kneel." "We have come to kneel." Ryland watched, dumbfounded, as the emissaries of one of the galaxy's oldest systems bent the knee before the woman who once burned their archives to ash. But this time, she did not demand tribute. She simply said, "Rise. We don't serve the past anymore." And they rose and left. That night, Sailor did not sleep. She stood at the edge of the garden, gazing at the stars as if waiting for one to blink out of existence. Ryland approached, a blanket slung over his shoulder. You all right? She didn't look at him but nodded. I thought I had to burn everything to fix anything. But maybe I was wrong. You weren't wrong, he said. You just weren't finished. She looked at him then, eyes softening. And now you're not alone. She stepped closer, and for the first time, the queen didn't command. She rested her head against his shoulder, and the stars, for once, didn't move. The architect's weeks passed. Months, maybe, or perhaps time no longer mattered. In the same way, the garden bloomed into something unnatural and holy. Beings from distant systems began to arrive not to challenge, but to witness. They didn't call her queen anymore. They called her keeper. Some called her mother of the forgotten. Others simply bowed in silence and wept. Ryland found himself fielding messages from all corners of the galactic web. Requests for wisdom, trade, sanctuary. He tried to keep up really, but he preferred fixing broken fans and boiling stew and yelling at the vines when they started growing into the vents. Sailor watched him like he was the only constant in a universe that had forgotten how to be gentle, and still, danger waited. One evening, an envoy arrived, dressed in mirrored chrome, face blank, body humming with translated malice. We are the architects of Dominion, it said. You stole from us. You unmade what was perfect. I broke your chain, Sailor answered. The envoy leaned forward. Chains are necessary, especially on monsters. Ryland stood behind her, arms folded, not a weapon in sight. Funny, he said. I've only seen monsters try to chain the people who scare them. The envoy twitched, then vanished in a flicker of light. No threat, no war, only the promise of reckoning. Sailor turned to him afterward. You don't have to stay, she said. No, he replied. That's why I do. The next morning, she found a ring in the garden, simple, made of fused starroot and old ship plating. Ryland was nowhere in sight. She spent 3 hours looking for him, swearing in languages no longer spoken. When she finally found him under the solar ray, fast asleep, she kicked his boot. You dropped something, she growled. He opened one eye. Guess you found it. She threw the ring at his chest. You idiot. You're welcome. She looked down at him for a long moment, then sat beside him, shoulder to shoulder, resting her head against his. Neither spoke, neither needed to. Above them, the garden hummed, and the stars, at long last, began to change their orbit. The wedding. There was no wedding, not the kind the galaxy understood anyway. No grand procession, no temple, no Hollywood screens capturing every moment in 1,000 languages. Only the garden, the dirt, the sky, and the two souls who'd seen the universe split and bleed, and still chose to stay. Solarian wore no gown. She wore her scars, her legacy, and the cloak she'd sewn from the torn banners of the empire she dismantled. Ryland wore his work shirt, still oil-stained from patching up the windshare turbines that morning. His hands were rough, hers calloused. But when their fingers met, the entire garden seemed to fall silent. The ceremony was watched only by those who mattered. Torin, the half-blind child from the refugee skiff she'd saved. Jexa, the former rival queen who once tried to assassinate her, now quietly tending the alien herbs that eased old pain. 2 scavenger drones perched like birds on a rusted hull fragment, and the roots of the garden, now thick and coiling, had grown into something vast, something aware. They curled gently toward the space between Sailor and Ryland, lifting 2 stones polished by time, offering them like gifts from a silent world that finally believed in softness. She took one, he took the other. Neither spoke vows. Instead, they simply stood there, unmoving, until the suns aligned overhead, until the ancient code embedded in the soil sang through the wind, until every thread of what they had endured no longer needed to be said. Then he said one thing anyway. I love you, Ryland whispered. Not because of what you were, but because of what you never let them kill. She looked at him, her mouth trembling, eyes wet, as if unsure how a woman who had shattered galaxies could deserve such words. And then, she did something no one in the universe could have predicted. She wept, not in grief, not in regret, in release. Later, they lay beneath the glowing canopy of the garden, entwined in peace. She traced the line of his jaw with fingers that once commanded fleets. Would you have still loved me if I'd never fallen from power? She asked. I wouldn't have known how, he answered. Back then, you wore armor too thick for me to see the woman inside. And now I see everything. She smiled, then small, tired, fierce. The way dying stars smile before they are reborn. The legacy. It didn't end with the garden. Nothing truly ended. not for them. The stars moved slower around Oros 9. Time itself bent near the roots of what they'd grown. The Dominion never returned, not with fire at least. Sailor's warning had spread like poetry through the neural networks of galactic law. Whole systems passed reforms simply to prove they had heard her voice. Entire empires stepped down from war without a single bullet fired, because they believed she might be watching. She never claimed credit. She didn't need to. Justice wasn't a crown anymore. It was a memory with teeth. Sailor taught refugees how to defend without conquering. She spoke to orphans like someone who had once been one. She held no court. Yet every ship that landed near the farm bowed its landing gear in silent respect. Reland opened a repair school not for machines, but for people. Ex-fighters, deserters, scavengers, the broken and unwanted came to learn how to build again. He taught them patience. He taught them how to find joy in fixing something small. Because if you could repair a broken circuit, maybe you could repair yourself. They built together. Homes, wells, shields powered by the garden's strange glow. A library holographic, of course, where Solarian archived not her battles, but her failures. She told the truth, even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt, and once a cycle. On the night of the twin eclipse, they sat in silence at the top of the ridge where her ship had first crashed. She kept the sword, but she never wielded it again. It sat buried in a pedestal of roots beneath the oldest tree in the garden, encased in living bark. No one dared touch it, not out of fear, out of reverence, out of understanding that some weapons, once laid down in peace, must never be raised again. One evening, decades later, a young girl from one of the outer colonies asked Sailor, "Are you a queen?" And the woman who had once commanded entire civilizations knelt to the child's eye level and said, "No, little one, I am a gardener." Rylan grinned from the doorframe, grease on his palms and laughter in his chest. "Don't let her fool you," he called. "She ruled the stars, and then I ruled myself." Sailorin added, smiling back. The stars above blinked, flickered, aligned, and far across the void, on planets she would never visit again, warships quietly powered down, armies disbanded, and children were named after her. Not to conquer, but to remember. Not the queen, not the terror, but the woman who buried her sword in the roots of a new world, and loved a man who taught her how to live.